June 4th, 1942, dawn breaks over the Pacific Ocean, 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii. The water stretches endless in every direction, empty and blue under a sky scattered with clouds. But the ocean is not empty. Beneath those clouds, 4 Japanese aircraft carriers steam eastward. The Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Huryu. Veterans of Pearl Harbor, the most powerful carrier strike force in the world. Aboard them are the finest naval aviators Japan has ever produced. Their mission to destroy what remains of the American Pacific Fleet and seize Midway Island, the last American outpost defending Hawaii. 200 miles to the northeast, 3 American carriers wait in ambush. The Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown. Battered, outnumbered, and crewed by pilots who learned to fly only months ago. They shouldn't stand a chance. But the Americans know something the Japanese don't. They know the Japanese are coming. They know where. They know when. And they know this is their only chance to turn the tide of a war they've been losing since December 7th. In the next 24 hours, the course of World War II will be decided. 4 Japanese carriers will go to the bottom of the Pacific. Japan's naval supremacy will be shattered forever. And a battle that should have been a Japanese victory will become one of the most stunning reversals in military history. This is the story of Midway, the battle that changed everything. The months after Pearl Harbor were the darkest in American military history. While the nation mobilized for war, while factories retooled and recruits trained, the Pacific Fleet fought a desperate holding action against an enemy that seemed unstoppable. On December 8, 1941, hours after Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces attacked the Philippines. The British colony of Hong Kong fell on Christmas Day. Singapore, the great British fortress in Asia, surrendered in February. The Dutch East Indies collapsed in March. Burma fell in May. Everywhere the Allies fought, they lost, fought. The Japanese Empire expanded at breathtaking speed, seizing territory, resources, and strategic positions across the Pacific and Southeast Asia. Admiral Yamamoto's plan was working perfectly. Japan had gained everything it needed. Oil from the Dutch East Indies, rubber from Malaya, rice from Indochina. The greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere was becoming a reality. But Yamamoto himself took no pleasure in these victories. He had warned Japan's leaders that he could run wild for 6 to 12 months. After that, America's industrial power would overwhelm them. The clock was ticking. For America, the losses were devastating not just militarily but psychologically. Pearl Harbor had unified the nation, filled recruitment centers, and sparked a determination to fight. But determination alone couldn't win battles. America needed time to build ships, train pilots, and move forces across the world's largest ocean. And time was something they didn't have. The only bright spot came on April 18, 1942. 16 B-25 bombers led by Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle launched from the carrier USS Hornet and bombed Tokyo. The raid caused minimal damage, but the psychological impact was enormous. Japan's home islands had been attacked. The military had promised the emperor this could never happen. In Tokyo, the raid sparked panic among Japan's military leadership. How had American bombers reached Japan? From which carrier? Where was that carrier now? The home islands were supposed to be invincible. Admiral Yamamoto saw the Doolittle raid as both an embarrassment and an opportunity. The raid proved that American carriers posed a direct threat to Japan. Those carriers had to be destroyed, and Yamamoto had a plan to draw them out. He would attack Midway. Midway Atoll was a tiny speck of coral in the Pacific, 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii. 2 small islands, Sand and Eastern, totaling less than 3 square miles of land. A few buildings, an airstrip, a seaplane base. Strategically, it was America's last forward outpost defending Hawaii. Yamamoto reasoned that if he attacked Midway, the Americans would have to respond. They couldn't allow Japan to seize territory that close to Hawaii. The remaining American carriers would rush to defend Midway. And when they did, the Japanese fleet would be waiting to destroy them. It would be Pearl Harbor in reverse. An ambush, a decisive battle, the end of American carrier power in the Pacific. Yamamoto assembled the largest naval force Japan had ever deployed. Nearly 200 ships, including 8 carriers, 11 battleships, and hundreds of support vessels. The plan was complex, with multiple task forces operating across the Pacific. A diversionary attack on the Aleutian Islands would draw American attention north. Then the main force would strike Midway from the west. Once Midway's defenses were destroyed, Japanese troops would invade and occupy the atoll. And when the American carriers arrived to retake it, the Japanese fleet would be waiting. Superior numbers, superior aircraft, superior pilots. It would be a slaughter. Yamamoto was confident, perhaps overconfident. The Japanese Navy had won every major engagement since the war began. Their pilots were veterans with years of training and combat experience. Their aircraft were superior to anything the Americans had. Their tactics were proven. Why would Midway be any different? But Yamamoto made assumptions. He assumed the Americans didn't know about the attack. He assumed they would respond exactly as he predicted. He assumed his forces would maintain the element of surprise. He was wrong on all counts. In a basement room beneath the 14th Naval District headquarters at Pearl Harbor, a team of codebreakers worked around the clock in conditions that can only be described as miserable. No windows, poor ventilation. The temperature hovered near 90 degrees. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and the smell of bodies that hadn't seen a shower in days. This was station hypo, and the men working here were about to change the course of the war. The team was led by Commander Joseph Rochefort, a naval intelligence officer who had spent years studying Japanese language and culture. Rochefort was brilliant, eccentric, and utterly devoted to breaking Japanese naval codes. He worked 20-hour days, slept on a cot in his office, and often wore a smoking jacket and slippers because the basement was either too hot or too cold. Since before Pearl Harbor, Rochefort's team had been intercepting Japanese radio transmissions and attempting to decrypt them. The main Japanese naval code, which the Americans called JN-25, had been partially broken. The codebreakers couldn't read everything, but they could read enough. In May 1942, they began noticing something unusual: increased Japanese radio traffic, references to an operation, a target designated AF, full, and a date, early June. Something big was coming. But what was AF? Rochefort believed AF was Midway. The context of the messages suggested a location in the Central Pacific. The timing suggested an imminent operation, but he needed proof. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, believed Rochefort, but others in naval intelligence in Washington disagreed. They thought AF was the Aleutian Islands or perhaps Hawaii itself. The debate raged through the chain of command. Rochefort devised a clever test. He had Midway send an uncoded radio message saying their water distillation plant had broken down and the island was running low on fresh water. It was deliberately sent in the clear so anyone listening could hear it. 2 days later, Station Hypo intercepted a Japanese message. "YAF is short of water." That was the proof. AF was Midway. The Japanese were coming. Nimitz now knew something no other American commander had known since the war began: where the enemy would attack, when they would attack, and in what strength. But knowing was one thing. Stopping them was another. The American Pacific Fleet was in no condition to fight a major battle. Of the 3 carriers available, the Yorktown had been badly damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea in early May. Navy estimates said she needed 3 months of repairs. Nimitz gave the shipyard 3 days. At Pearl Harbor, repair crews swarmed over the Yorktown in round-the-clock shifts. Welders worked on the flight deck while electricians rewired damaged systems below. Carpenters patched holes in the hull. It was makeshift, temporary, barely adequate. But after 72 hours, the Yorktown was declared seaworthy. She wasn't fully repaired. She was held together with welds, patches, and prayer. But she could steam, and she could launch aircraft. That would have to be enough. Nimitz assembled his forces. The Enterprise and Hornet under Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, the Yorktown under Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher. Together they embarked about 230 aircraft, fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers. Against them, the Japanese were bringing 4 fleet carriers with over 250 aircraft, plus 2 light carriers with the Aleutian Force, plus battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and hundreds of land-based aircraft. On paper, it wasn't even close. The Americans were outnumbered, outgunned, and facing pilots who had been training since the 1930s. American aviators, by contrast, were mostly rookies. Many had less than a year of flight training. Some had never dropped a torpedo in combat. But the Americans had one decisive advantage. They knew the Japanese were coming. Nimitz's orders to his carriers were specific. Position themselves northeast of Midway. Stay hidden. Wait for the Japanese to commit to their attack on Midway. Then strike at the Japanese carriers while their decks were crowded with aircraft being rearmed and refueled. It was a gamble. Everything depended on timing, surprise, and luck. If the Japanese spotted the American carriers first, it would be over. If the American attack was too early or too late, it would fail. If the Japanese changed their plans, the ambush would collapse. But Nimitz had faith in his intelligence team. He had faith in Rochefort. And he had no other choice. On May 28th, the Enterprise and Hornet sailed from Pearl On May 30th, the patched-together Yorktown followed. They took up positions northeast of Midway in an area designated Point Luck and waited. The Japanese fleet was already at sea, steaming east. Admiral Nagumo, commanding the carrier strike force, had no idea American carriers were anywhere near Midway. Japanese intelligence believed the Yorktown had been sunk at Coral Sea. They believed the Enterprise and Hornet were still near Pearl Harbor or perhaps down in the South Pacific. The Japanese were sailing into a trap, and they had no idea. On June 3rd, American patrol planes spotted Japanese ships 700 miles west of Midway. It was the invasion force, the transports carrying troops to occupy the island. But the carriers weren't with them. Where were the carriers? That night, on Midway itself, the small garrison prepared for the attack everyone knew was coming. Marines manned anti-aircraft guns. Pilots stood by their aircraft. There were about 30 fighters on the island, a mix of outdated Brewster Buffaloes and a few newer Wildcats. There were also dive bombers and torpedo bombers, most of them obsolete. The defenders of Midway knew they were outnumbered and outgunned, but they also knew help was coming. Somewhere out there in the dark Pacific, the American carriers were waiting. The sun set on June 3rd, a few scattered clouds. Calm seas, perfect weather for a naval battle. At 4:30 a.m. on June 4th, the Japanese carrier strike force launched its first wave of aircraft. 108 planes, bombers, fighters, torpedo planes. Their target, Midway Island. Their mission, destroy the defenses Admiral Nagumo stood on the bridge of the Akagi and watched his aircraft disappear into the dawn sky. Everything was proceeding according to plan. He had no idea that 200 miles away, American carriers were already turning into the wind, preparing to launch their own strike. The Battle of Midway was about to begin. 4:30 a.m., the Japanese strike Midway. The Japanese attack on Midway was brutally efficient. The bombers came in high, dropping their payloads on hangars, fuel tanks, and the airstrip. Fighters swept low, strafing anything that moved. The few American fighters that managed to get airborne were hopelessly outmatched. Marine Captain John Carey led a squadron of Buffaloes against the Japanese formation. The Buffaloes were obsolete, slow, and poorly armed compared to the Japanese Zeros. Carey's squadron was massacred. Of 15 fighters that engaged, 13 were shot down. Carey himself was hit multiple times but managed to crash land his burning aircraft on the beach. The bombing lasted about 20 minutes. When the Japanese planes withdrew, Midway was burning, but it was still operational. The runways were cratered but usable. The anti-aircraft batteries were still firing. The radio still worked. At 7:20 a.m., the Japanese strike leader, Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, radioed back to Admiral Nagumo. There is need for a second attack. Midway's defenses hadn't been destroyed. The island was hurt but not neutralized. Another strike would be needed. Nagumo faced a decision. He had held back half his aircraft as a reserve, armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for use against any American ships that might appear. Should he send them against Midway instead? His scout planes had found nothing. The ocean to the east appeared empty. The intelligence report said the American carriers were nowhere near. The most immediate threat was Midway itself, still capable of launching aircraft. At 7:15 a.m., Nagumo made his decision. Rearm the reserve aircraft with bombs for a second strike on Midway. The order went out. On the hangar decks of 4 carriers, crews swarmed over the aircraft, removing torpedoes, wheeling them away, bringing up bombs. It was chaos. Organized chaos, but chaos nonetheless. And then, at 7:28 a.m., everything changed. A Japanese scout plane, delayed in its launch by mechanical problems, finally radioed in its report. Sight what appears to be 10 enemy surface ships, bearing 10 degrees, distance 240 miles from Midway. Nagumo stared at the message. Ships? What ships? Were they carriers? Were they carriers? He radioed back. Ascertain ship types. For 15 agonizing minutes, there was no response. The crews continued rearming aircraft. Torpedoes off, bombs on. The hangar decks were littered with weapons, fuel lines, and ammunition. At 7:47 a.m., the scout plane reported again. Enemy is accompanied by what appears to be a carrier. A carrier. The Americans had a carrier out there. Nagumo's blood ran cold. His aircraft were configured for a ground attack, not a naval engagement. His decks were cluttered with aircraft being rearmed. The first wave was returning from Midway low on fuel, needing to land immediately. He gave new orders. Stop the rearming. Put the torpedoes back on. Prepare for a strike against the American carrier. The hangar decks descended into pandemonium. Torpedoes back on. Bombs off. Fuel lines disconnected. Aircraft moved, the returning Midway strikes circling overhead, running out of fuel. Nagumo made another decision. Land the Midway strike first, refuel them, then launch everything at once against the American carrier. One massive strike that would overwhelm the Americans. It was the correct tactical decision, but it would take time. Precious time. Time the Americans would not give him. 7:00 a.m. The American launch on the Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown. The American carriers had begun launching aircraft over an hour earlier. The moment the Japanese attack on Midway was detected, Admiral Spruance ordered an immediate strike. The launch was chaotic and rough. Normally, carriers would coordinate, launching all aircraft in an organized formation. But there was no time for coordination. Every squadron launched as soon as it was ready and headed independently toward the last known Japanese position. From the Hornet, 15 torpedo bombers, 35 dive bombers, 10 fighters. From the Enterprise, 14 torpedo bombers, 37 dive bombers, 10 fighters. From the Yorktown, 12 torpedo bombers, 17 dive bombers, 6 fighters, 156 aircraft. Nearly every plane the American carriers had. It was everything. If this attack failed, there would be no reserve, no second chance. The American pilots were nervous. Most had never been in combat. They were flying toward 4 Japanese carriers protected by Zeros, the most feared fighter in the Pacific. Their aircraft were inferior. Their torpedoes were unreliable. Their odds of survival were poor. But they flew anyway. The torpedo squadrons went in first. They had to fly low and slow to drop their torpedoes, making them easy targets for fighters and anti-aircraft fire. It was the most dangerous job in naval aviation. Torpedo Squadron 8 from the Hornet, led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, found the Japanese fleet first. 9:20 a.m. The death of Torpedo 8 Waldron was a tough, no-nonsense officer who had trained his men relentlessly. He was part Sioux Indian, fiercely proud and absolutely convinced he would find the Japanese carriers even if he had to search the entire Pacific. At 9:20 a.m. he spotted smoke on the horizon. The Japanese fleet. His squadron consisted of 15 TBD Devastator torpedo bombers. Slow, obsolete aircraft that had to lumber along at 100 knots to drop their torpedoes. They had no fighter escort. The fighters that were supposed to protect them had gotten separated in the clouds and never found them. Waldron knew what he was flying into. Before launching, he had told his men, "If there is only one plane left to make a final run, I want that man to go in and get a hit." He led his squadron straight at the Japanese carriers. Within minutes, Zeros swarmed them. Anti-aircraft fire filled the sky. The Devastators, slow and defenseless, were slaughtered. One by one, they were shot down. Burning aircraft cartwheeled into the sea. Some exploded in midair. Others hit the water and broke apart. Ensign George Gay was flying the last plane in the formation. He watched every aircraft ahead of him get shot down. Zeros riddled his plane with bullets. His gunner was killed. His controls were damaged. But he kept going, released his torpedo, and then crashed into the ocean. He was the only survivor of Torpedo 8. 15 planes launched. 1 man lived. Gay floated in the water, clinging to a seat cushion, watching the battle unfold around him. For the next 30 hours, he would have a front row seat to the most important naval battle of the war. 9:40 a.m. The slaughter continues. Torpedo Squadron 6 from the Enterprise arrived next. 14 planes. No fighter escort. They met the same fate as Torpedo 8. 10 were shot down. No hits. Torpedo Squadron 3 from the Yorktown came in at 10 a.m. 12 planes. No. They had 6 Wildcat fighters with them, but it wasn't enough. 7 torpedo bombers were shot down. No hits. In 40 minutes, the Americans had lost 41 torpedo bombers out of 41 that attacked. Not a single torpedo hit a Japanese ship. It was a massacre. On the Japanese carriers, the crews were jubilant. The American attack had been defeated. Their Zeros had crushed the enemy. Their ships were undamaged. As soon as the last of the Midway strike was recovered, they could launch their own attack and destroy the American carriers. Admiral Nagumo allowed himself to relax slightly. The Americans had shown their hand. They had thrown their torpedo planes at him and failed. Now it was Japan's turn. On the decks of the 4 carriers, aircraft were lined up, engines running, ready to launch, bombers armed with torpedoes. Fighters ready to escort. In 10 minutes, they would be... But those 10 minutes would make all the difference. 10:20 a.m., 5 minutes that changed the war. High above the Japanese fleet, 3 squadrons of American dive bombers had been searching for the carriers. They had launched over an hour ago, flown to where the Japanese were supposed to be, and found nothing. They were lost, running low on fuel and about to give up. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading the Enterprise dive bombers, made a decision. Instead of turning back, he would search a little longer, just a few more minutes. At 10:05 a.m., he spotted a Japanese destroyer moving at high speed, cutting a white wake through the blue water. The destroyer was heading northeast, towards something. McCluskey followed the wake. At 10:20 a.m., he saw them. 4 carriers sailing in a box formation, their decks covered with aircraft, perfect targets. From the Yorktown, another squadron of dive bombers arrived at almost the same moment, led by Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie. The 2 American formations, which had launched separately and flown different routes, arrived over the Japanese fleet at exactly the same time. It was pure chance. Pure luck, but it was about to become the most devastating air attack in naval history. McCluskey radioed his pilots, "Attack!" The dive bombers rolled over and plunged toward the carriers below. The Japanese, focused on recovering aircraft and preparing for their own strike, didn't see them until it was too late. 10:22 a.m. The Akagi dies. The first bomb hit the Akagi near the after elevator. It penetrated the flight deck and detonated in the upper hangar. Aircraft parked there, loaded with fuel and torpedoes, exploded. Fire spread instantly. A second bomb hit forward near the amidships elevator. More explosions. More fire. The Akagi's deck was an inferno. Aircraft burned. Fuel lines ruptured. Torpedoes cooked off, detonating with massive explosions that tore through the ship's structure. Within minutes, the carrier was a floating wreck, consumed by fire. Admiral Nagumo on the Akagi's bridge watched in horror as his flagship died beneath him. Officers urged him to transfer to another ship. He refused at first, unwilling to leave. Finally, he was physically carried off the bridge and taken by boat to a cruiser. The Akagi would burn for hours before being scuttled by Japanese destroyers. The pride of the Japanese fleet, the carrier that had launched the attack on Pearl Harbor, was gone. 10:24 a.m. The Kaga falls 2 miles away. Dive bombers from the Enterprise found the carrier Kaga. The first bomb hit near the forward elevator. The explosion ignited aviation fuel stored below decks. Fire erupted across the hangar. More bombs followed. 3, 4. Each one tearing into the carrier's guts, detonating among parked aircraft and fuel tanks. The Kaga's crew fought desperately to save their ship. Damage control teams battled the fires, but the flames spread faster than they could contain them. Explosions rocked the carrier's ammunition and fuel detonated. The flight deck buckled. The superstructure collapsed. By 10:30 a.m., the Kaga was a burning hulk, listing heavily. The order came to abandon ship. Sailors dove into the sea as explosions continued to tear the ship apart. She would sink at 7:25 p.m., taking 800 men with her. 10:26 a.m., the Soryo burns the third carrier. Soryo was hit by dive bombers from the Yorktown. 3 bombs in rapid succession. All 3 struck the flight deck and penetrated to the hangar below. The Soryu had been loading its aircraft with fuel and weapons. The bombs set off a chain reaction of explosions that turned the hangar into a blast furnace. The carrier's captain, Rusaku Yanagimoto, ordered the crew to abandon ship. He chose to go down with his vessel. The Soryu burned throughout the afternoon, her hull glowing red hot. She sank at 7:13 p.m. Only a few hundred of her crew survived. 10:30 a.m. The silence in 5 minutes, 3 Japanese fleet carriers had been mortally wounded. The elite of the Japanese Navy, the veterans of Pearl Harbor, were dying. Nail. The 4th carrier, Hurriya Trio, was separated from the others by several miles. She escaped the initial attack. She was now the only operational Japanese carrier remaining. On the American carriers, pilots returning from the attack were jubilant. They reported massive hits. Carriers burned. It seemed too good to be true. Admiral Spruance, cautious by nature, didn't celebrate. One Japanese carrier was still out there, and until it was found and destroyed, the battle wasn't over. He was right to be cautious. At 12 a.m., Japanese dive bombers from the Hurriyo found the Yorktown. 12:10 p.m. Attack on the Yorktown. The Yorktown's radar picked up the incoming Japanese aircraft at 40 miles out. 18 dive bombers escorted by 6 Zeros. Not a large force, but enough to do serious damage. Admiral Fletcher ordered the Yorktown to general quarters. Fighters scrambled to intercept. The carrier turned into the wind to launch more aircraft and increase maneuverability. The Yorktown's fighter director, watching his radar screen, vectored Wildcats toward the incoming Japanese. The American fighters shot down several dive bombers before they reached the carrier. But some got through. At 12:10 p.m., the first Japanese dive bomber rolled into its attack. Anti-aircraft fire filled the sky. The Japanese pilot, his aircraft trailing smoke, held his dive until the last possible moment, then released his bomb and pulled up. The bomb hit the Yorktown's flight deck and penetrated to the fourth deck before detonating. The explosion killed or wounded 66 men and started fires in the rag storage compartment. 2 more bombs hit in rapid succession. One knocked out the boilers, cutting the carrier's speed from 30 knots to 6. Another penetrated to the third deck and exploded among aircraft in the hangar. The Yorktown was hurt, badly hurt. She was listing dead in the water, burning in multiple locations. It looked like Pearl Harbor all over again. But the Yorktown's damage control teams were the best in the fleet. They fought the fires, they shored up bulkheads, they patched holes. And miraculously, they got the boilers relit. By 1:40 p.m., barely 90 minutes after the attack, the Yorktown was making 20 knots. Her flight deck was operational. Aircraft were landing and refueling. It was an incredible achievement, a testament to American engineering and determination. But the Japanese weren't done. 2:30 p.m., the second strike, the Hurriya launched a second strike. 10 torpedo bombers, 6 fighters. They found the Yorktown at 2:30 p.m. and pressed home their attack despite fierce anti-aircraft fire. The torpedo bombers came in low, skimming the waves. American fighters shot down 5. Anti-aircraft guns got 2 more, but 3 bombers got close enough to launch their torpedoes. 2 torpedoes hit the Yorktown on her port side. The explosions tore massive holes in the hull. Seawater flooded in. The carrier took on a severe list, 17 degrees to port. Power failed. The rudder jammed. The list increased to 26 degrees. The ship was dying. At 3:00 p.m., Captain Elliot Buckmaster gave the order to abandon ship. Sailors slid down ropes into the water. Destroyers moved in to pick up survivors. The Yorktown, her flight deck tilted at a crazy angle, lay dead in the water, but she refused to sink. Throughout the afternoon, the Yorktown wallowed in the swells, listing heavily but somehow staying afloat. Damage control teams had sealed enough compartments to keep her buoyant. Captain Buckmaster, watching from a destroyer, began to think she might be salvaged, but that would have to wait. There was still one Japanese carrier to deal with. 3:30 p.m. Finding the Hurriya, American search planes had been looking for the 4th Japanese carrier all morning. Finally, at 2:45 p.m., a scout from the Yorktown found her. The Hurriya, 110 miles northwest of the American fleet, launching the strike that would cripple the Yorktown. Admiral Spruance didn't hesitate. Every available dive bomber on the Enterprise and Hornet was rearmed and launched. 24 aircraft, it was all he had left. They found the Hurriya at 5:00 p.m. She was steaming at high speed, her escorts scattered around her, ready for an attack. But there was no way to hide a carrier. She was massive, vulnerable, and alone. The American dive bombers attacked out of the sun. The first bomb hit the forward elevator, jamming it in the up position. The second hit near the bridge, killing many of the senior officers. 2 more bombs hit the flight deck, starting fires in the hangar. The Hurriya burned. Her crew fought the fires for hours, but the flames spread too fast. Explosions rocked the carrier as fuel and ammunition cooked off. By 2:00 a.m. on June 5th, the fires were out of control. At 4:30 a.m., the Hurriya's captain gave the order to abandon ship. Japanese destroyers fired torpedoes into the burning carrier, sending her to the bottom. All 4 Japanese fleet carriers were gone. June 5th, Yamamoto's decision aboard the battleship Yamato 600 miles to the west. Admiral Yamamoto received the reports in stunned silence. 4 carriers lost. The cream of Japanese naval aviation gone in a single day. Hundreds of experienced pilots dead. His staff urged him to continue the operation. He still had battleships, cruisers, destroyers. He could shell Midway, force a night surface action with the American carriers. Japan could still win. But Yamamoto knew better. Without air cover, his battleships were sitting ducks for American aircraft. The element of surprise was gone. The Americans had won the carrier battle decisively. At 2:55 a.m. on June 5th, Yamamoto gave the order, "The Midway operation is canceled, the fleet will withdraw." It was the first Japanese retreat of the war. The myth of Japanese invincibility was shattered. The Yorktown, meanwhile, was still afloat. On June 5th, Captain Buckmaster returned to the ship with a salvage crew. They were going to save her, tow her back to Pearl Harbor, repair her again. Throughout the day, sailors worked to stabilize the carrier. They pumped out water. They cut away wreckage. They attached tow lines. A destroyer, the Hammond, came alongside to provide power and pumping equipment. By evening, the Yorktown's list had been reduced to 2 degrees. She was going to make it. But Japanese submarine I-168, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Yahachi Tanabe, had been stalking the crippled carrier for hours. At 1:30 p.m. on June 6th, Tanabe positioned his submarine for an attack. He fired 4 torpedoes. One hit the Hammond, breaking the destroyer in half. She sank in 4 minutes, taking 80 men with her. 2 more torpedoes hit the Yorktown, tearing new holes in her already battered hull. The salvage crew abandoned ship again. The Yorktown, mortally wounded, began her final struggle. Throughout the night of June 6th, she drifted. Her list increased slowly. Water flooded more compartments. But still, she wouldn't sink. Dawn came on June 7th, and the Yorktown was still there, listing 30 degrees but afloat. At 5 a.m., the list suddenly increased. The carrier rolled onto her beam ends. For a moment she hung there, her island superstructure nearly touching the water. Then, slowly, the Yorktown capsized. Her hull, painted red below the waterline, rose into the air. She hung there for a few seconds, suspended as if reluctant to leave. At 5:01 a.m., she slipped beneath the waves. The Yorktown had survived Pearl Harbor, the Coral Sea, and 2 air attacks at Midway. She had been bombed, torpedoed, set on fire, abandoned, reboarded, and torpedoed again. She had fought to the very end. Of the 2,270 men aboard during the battle, 141 died. But the ship saved the rest, staying afloat long enough for them to escape. The Battle of Midway was over. The cost was staggering. Japan lost 4 fleet carriers, the Akagi, Kaga, Sorius, and Hurryu. 1 heavy cruiser sunk. Over 3,000 men dead. More than 250 aircraft destroyed. And, most critically, over 100 experienced pilots killed, men who had trained for years and could never be replaced. America lost 1 carrier, the Yorktown, 1 destroyer, the Hammond, 307 men killed, about 150 aircraft lost. By any measure, it was a decisive American victory, the greatest naval victory in American history, but the full impact wouldn't be clear for months. For Japan, Midway was catastrophic not because of the ships lost, but because of what those ships represented. Japanese industry could build new carriers. They had 2 under construction already, but building a carrier took 2 years. Training a carrier pilot took 5 years. And training a crew to operate as a cohesive unit took even longer. The 4 carriers sunk at Midway were the core of Japanese naval air power. The pilots aboard them had trained together since the 1930s. They had attacked Pearl Harbor, raided the Indian Ocean, conquered Southeast Asia. They were irreplaceable. After Midway, Japan would never again have the carrier strength to conduct offensive operations. They would spend the rest of the war on the defensive, reacting to American moves, slowly retreating. Admiral Yamamoto had predicted Japan could run wild for 6 to 12 months. Midway came 6 months and 1 day after Pearl Harbor. His prediction was almost exact. For America, Midway was transformational. It proved that American pilots, though inexperienced, could defeat the best Japan had. It proved that American intelligence, particularly the codebreakers at Station Hypo, could provide a decisive advantage. It proved that American industry, American determination, and American innovation could overcome initial defeats. Most importantly, it shifted the psychological balance of the war. Since Pearl Harbor, Americans had been on the defensive, absorbing losses, retreating. Midway changed that. America was no longer reacting. America was dictating terms. The victory sparked wild celebrations across the United States. Newspapers ran banner headlines. Radio broadcasts repeated the news over and over. After 6 months of defeat, Americans finally had something to celebrate. But for the men who fought the battle, the celebration was muted. They had seen too many friends die. Torpedo 8 wiped out to the last man. The Yorktown's crew abandoning ship twice, the pilots who never returned. George Gay, the sole survivor of Torpedo 8, was rescued by a patrol plane on June 5th. He had floated in the ocean for 30 hours, watching the battle, watching his squadron mates die. When he was brought aboard the Enterprise, he broke down and wept. "They were all better pilots than me," he said. "It should have been me." Commander Wade McCluskey, who led the dive bombers that sank the Akagi and Kaga, returned to the Enterprise with his fuel tanks bone dry. He landed, climbed out of his aircraft, and collapsed on the deck. He had pushed himself and his men to the absolute limit. Admiral Spruance, the tactical commander of the American carriers, never celebrated. He spent the days after the battle writing letters to the families of the dead. He knew the victory had been close. If the dive bombers had arrived 5 minutes later, if the Japanese had spotted the American carriers first, the outcome could have been completely different. Luck had played a role. The Americans admitted that, but they had also been prepared, disciplined, and willing to take risks. And they had been aided by the finest intelligence operation of the war. Commander Joe Rochefort and his team at Station Hypo received little public recognition. Their work was classified. They couldn't tell anyone what they had done. But Admiral Nimitz knew. He knew that without Rochefort, without the codebreakers, Midway would have been a disaster. Nimitz visited Station Hypo personally after the battle. He found Rochefort still in his basement, still in his bathrobe, still chain-smoking. Nimitz shook his hand. "This victory was yours," Nimitz said. "You deserve a major share of the credit." Rochefort shrugged. "We just read their mail, sir." For Japan, the disaster at Midway was covered up. The Japanese public was not told about the carrier losses. Newspapers reported a great victory. Sailors from the sunken carriers were quarantined upon returning to Japan, forbidden from speaking about what happened. The myth of Japanese invincibility had to be maintained. But within the Japanese military, the truth was known. Yamamoto knew, the Naval General Staff knew, Emperor Hirohito knew. Japan had suffered its first major defeat, and there would be no recovering from it. Yamamoto would continue to command the combined fleet, but his aggressive spirit was broken. He had gambled at Midway and lost. He had warned that Japan could only run wild for 6 months. He had been proven right. In April 1943, less than a year after Midway, Yamamoto's aircraft was intercepted and shot down by American fighters over Bougainville. The Americans knew exactly where he would be because they had broken the Japanese codes again. Yamamoto died in the jungle, still strapped in his seat. He was 59 years old. The war would continue for 3 more years. There would be more battles, more islands, more deaths. Guadalcanal, Tatarawa, Saipan, and Guadalcanal, the Philippines. Each one is a brutal, grinding fight, but the outcome was never really in doubt after Midway. Japan had lost its chance to win. America had gained the initiative and would never give it back. On September 2, 1945, Japan surrendered aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. The war was over. America had won. Among the American officers present at the surrender ceremony was Admiral Raymond Spruance, who had commanded the carriers at Midway. He stood quietly on the deck, watching the Japanese delegation sign the surrender documents. A reporter asked him later how he felt. "Relieved," Spruance said. "Just relieved it's over." The Battle of Midway lasted 2 days, but its impact lasted the rest of the war and beyond. It proved that intelligence wins wars, that courage matters even when the odds are impossible. That luck favors the prepared. That industrial power, given time, will overwhelm tactical brilliance. It also demonstrated the terrible cost of war. The men of Torpedo 8, who flew into certain death. The sailors trapped aboard the Yorktown fighting to save their ship. The Japanese pilots who died in the explosions aboard the carriers. All of them were brave. All of them did their duty. And hundreds of them never came home. Today, the wrecks of the 4 Japanese carriers lie on the ocean floor, 17,000 feet down in the dark Pacific. The Yorktown rests nearby, her hull slowly corroding in the salt water. They are war graves, monuments to the men who fought and died there. Every year, survivors of the battle gather to remember. Their numbers dwindle with each passing year. Soon there will be none left, but the story of Midway will endure. It is a story of how a nation, reeling from disaster, found the will to fight back. How ordinary men, most of them barely out of their teens, accomplished something extraordinary. How 5 minutes of courage changed the course of history. The Battle of Midway was the turning point of the Pacific War. It was the moment America stopped losing and started winning. It was the moment Japan's empire reached its zenith and began its long collapse. And it all happened in 5 minutes on a June morning in 1942 when American dive bombers emerged from the clouds and found 4 Japanese carriers with their decks full of aircraft. 5 minutes. That's all it took. 5 minutes that changed the world.